Welcome to one of the strangest and most unexpected conflicts in history, the Great Emu War of Australia. Yes, you heard it right, a war against emus. Picture it, trained soldiers carrying guns, going head-to-head against emus, flightless birds known for their speed, stamina, and surprisingly strategic evasive skills. And the result? The emus actually won. Well, at least in a manner of speaking. To understand how this unusual war came about and how these oversized birds managed to defeat the soldiers of the Australian Army, we'll need to take a step back to understand the context, the combat, and the aftermath of this battle that would end up being both comical and catastrophic. Setting the scene, post-World War I, Australia. The year was 1932. Australia was still recovering from the devastation of World War I. Soldiers, many of them recently returned veterans, were struggling to adapt back to civilian life. To support the country's agricultural sector and provide a livelihood for these veterans, the Australian government implemented a land settlement scheme which encouraged former soldiers to take up farming in Western Australia. In theory, this sounded like a win-win. They'd be given land, and in return, they'd grow wheat, produce livestock, and help feed the nation. But reality had a different story in mind. Farming was far more challenging than expected, and the Great Depression was in full swing. Wheat prices plummeted to levels that were unsustainable, leaving farmers who had invested heavily in equipment and labor in a tight spot. To make matters worse, their government promised subsidies for wheat but never delivered them, making things increasingly desperate for these farmers. And then, just when things couldn't get worse, an invasion arrived on their land. But it wasn't from a foreign army, it was an invasion of emus. Emu invasion. The arrival of the feathered foes. Emus are large, flightless birds native to Australia, standing over 5 feet tall and capable of running at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. They are known for their long legs, powerful kick, and uncanny ability to evade predators. Usually, emus migrated through the Australian landscape in search of food and water. But in 1932, the emus found something else, a seemingly endless buffet of ripening wheat crops. With food and water sources drying up in the outback due to drought, emus were drawn to the farmlands en masse. Western Australian wheat fields became emu playgrounds, with these birds devouring crops, trampling fields, and leaving behind destruction in their wake. By some estimates, up to 20,000 emus roamed the farmland in packs, leaving desperate farmers reeling. The emus had little regard for boundaries or crops. They were, after all, just following their instincts. But for the farmers, it was personal. Their livelihoods were being decimated. So after the farmers pleaded with the government to save their crops, a military solution was proposed. Surely, the well-trained Australian Army could handle a bunch of birds. The call to arms, the military's strange new mission. In November 1932, the Australian government responded with an unusual plan. They dispatched a military unit led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, along with soldiers armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They were ready to unleash firepower on the emus and eradicate the menace. The mission was clear: take out the emus, protect the crops, and safeguard the future of the struggling farmers. It was an odd sight. Soldiers in military uniforms carrying machine guns and hunting emus in the Australian outback. Major Meredith and his soldiers believed they'd accomplish their task swiftly, efficiently, and decisively. After all, what could go wrong? Battle begins. The emu tactics and the chaos that followed. The soldiers set up their ambush, expecting to catch the emus off guard. On November 2nd, 1932, the first operation commenced. A flock of about 50 emus came into sight, and the soldiers took aim, unleashing their firepower. But the emus had other plans. To the soldiers' surprise, the emus scattered in all directions, zigzagging across the landscape. Their speed and agility made them difficult targets, and only a handful were killed. More escaped into the wilderness, unharmed. The soldiers soon discovered that emus didn't behave like traditional enemies. They moved erratically and in unpredictable groups, each bird following its own chaotic path. It was as if the emus had instinctively developed evasive strategies that even the best-trained human soldiers couldn't counter. To make matters worse, the machine guns, meant to handle human forces, frequently jammed due to the rugged conditions of the outback. After a few days of unsuccessful hunts, the soldiers tried a new tactic. They decided to mount one of the machine guns on a truck, hoping it would give them an advantage in chasing the birds. But this approach turned into slapstick comedy. The rough terrain made it almost impossible to aim accurately, and the truck bounced wildly as it attempted to pursue the speedy birds. Even when the gun could be fired, it either missed wildly or jammed. As the days went on, Major Meredith began to realize that they were fighting a losing battle. The emus were surviving, the crops were still being ravaged, and the soldiers were starting to lose morale. They were humiliated, and they hadn't anticipated that a flock of birds could pose such a monumental challenge. A turning point when the army retreated. After nearly a month of failed attempts and several rounds of ammunition expended with little to show for it, the government decided to pull the plug on the Great Emu War. It was clear that the emus had won this battle through no other skill than sheer survival instincts and the ability to scatter in unpredictable patterns. Major Meredith, reflecting on his role in the conflict, later admitted with frustration, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." He was convinced the emus were some of the toughest opponents he'd ever faced. The birds were relentless and had an extraordinary ability to withstand bullets. In early December, the military withdrew, and the farmers were left to deal with the emus on their own. The soldiers returned, somewhat embarrassed by the fact that an entire army operation had been thwarted by a bunch of flightless birds. The aftermath: Emu War consequences. The Great Emu War became an object of mockery, both within Australia and abroad. Newspapers wrote stories of the emu defeat with humor and disbelief. It was one of those strange, absurd episodes in history that made people question how such a plan was even conceived. But for the farmers, the outcome was anything but funny. Their crops remained vulnerable, and the emus continued to roam through the farmland. After the military's withdrawal, farmers were given limited access to rifles and were essentially left to fend for themselves. In the end, many of the farmers had to resort to fencing and other methods to keep the emus at bay. The Great Emu War also raised a few eyebrows politically. Critics questioned why the government had opted for military intervention against emus in the first place. Some argued it was a misuse of resources, while others felt that the government had failed to protect the farmers adequately, leaving them to face nature's challenges alone. Legacy of the Great Emu War. Decades later, the Great Emu War is remembered as one of the most peculiar and humorous conflicts in military history. The story of Australian soldiers going up against a horde of emus still brings a chuckle. However, it's also a reminder of the challenges farmers faced in Western Australia during the Great Depression and the lengths they went to try to protect their land. In 1950, following another surge in the emu population, the government initiated another round of control measures, though they chose a more systematic approach involving bounty programs and fencing. The emus, meanwhile, remain one of Australia's most iconic animals, their resilience against machine guns cementing them as legends. Today, emus are protected under Australian law as a native species, allowing them to roam the countryside without fear of armed soldiers. The Great Emu War reminds us that not all battles are between men or nations. Sometimes it's humanity versus nature, and nature has a funny way of fighting back. So next time you hear the phrase, "nature always finds a way," think of the emus, who once faced an army and came out the other side, unconquered and unbothered. And that, my friends, is the story of Australia's Great Emu War. A bizarre yet fascinating tale of military might going toe-to-toe with nature and nature winning in the end. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's most unexpected battles, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more intriguing stories from the past.